Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special briefing by Dr. William Partlett, the Stephen Charles Fellow for the Centre for Public Integrity. Stephen Charles, the great Australian lawyer and former judge, as you know, is celebrated by the Centre for his pioneering work and advocacy for what Will has identified as the integrity movement in Australia. Will is speaking to us from Montreal in Canada. Hello, Will, and thanks for doing this.
Hi, happy to be here.
Before we start this briefing, a short reminder of Will Partlett's expertise. He's Associate Professor, University of Melbourne Law School, and Director of the Centre for Comparative Constitutional Studies. There's a new book on the deceptive democratic logic of constitutional centralisation and how to counter it. Before his arrival in Melbourne in 2015, Dr. Partlett was Assistant Professor at the Faculty of Law of Chinese University of Hong Kong, a postdoctoral research fellow and lecturer at Columbia University Law School, and a fellow at the Brookings Institution. He holds a JD from Stanford Law School, as well as a D.Phil in Soviet history and M.Phil in Russian and East European studies from the University of Oxford, where he was a Clarendon Scholar. He also holds an honours bachelor's degree in international affairs and public policy from Princeton University. And he speaks Russian. Geez, what a perspective from authoritarian China to corrupt Russia to what we like to call democratic Australia. Will, you've embarked on an historical research project now producing what you're calling dispatches to timeline and understand the evolution of anti-corruption and integrity oversight in Australia. And you go back to the constitutional conventions and debates before Australia became a federation in 1901. I've just read your article on how Australia developed so distinctive a form of democracy and what you call popular political constitutionalism. After dispossession, we were just one of many British colonies around the world, divided on this continent into 6 separate colonies, later called states, through the 19th century. How did the Australian Constitution fundamentally differ from the then British conception of democracy with its institutions, but separately established by our own constitution?
Well, thanks, Quentin. If we look all the way back to the original kind of historical foundations, we can see in Australia the distinctive role of the people in the Australian constitutional order. And we can trace that all the way back to the success of the Chartist movement in the 1850s and 60s and 70s in Australia, which can be contrasted with the failure of the Chartist movement in Britain and the UK. So we have, from the very beginning, a commitment to a broad, universal form of suffrage that ever since then has continued to expand, obviously. And also at the same time, an egalitarian culture that comes out of that period as well. So the role of the people has been distinct and has always been, and the Australian system has always been less elitist, less parliamentary centered than the UK. And that kind of role for the people, and of course the people has expanded. I mean, the people in 1890s and 1900 it was a racist conception of the people. That conception has changed over time and expanded, and we see that in the electoral changes, the role of the electoral college, the electoral commission, and so forth, and also finally in the rise of the integrity anti-corruption movement in Australia as well, which have really been portrayed as agents of the people and ensuring and monitoring our public officials to ensure that they act in our best interests and act in the public trust. So I think throughout there's been this deep and evolving, I think, commitment to ensuring that the people have a foundational principal role in our system.
We've got parliaments all over Australia in our federal system, federal, state and territory. And there was, you mentioned bicameralism, the lower house and the upper house, with the upper houses playing, even apart from adversarial politics, an investigative or oversight role through their upper house committees. Was that important?
Yeah, I mean, that's been one of the big developments since the end of World War II has been the rise of proportional representation in our upper houses. So obviously the Senate Prime Minister Chifley brings in the Senate, and at the Commonwealth level is elected according to proportional representation, and then the states follow suit after that. With the exception of Queensland, which is unicameral, every other state now has elected, as the upper house is elected according to proportional representation. And that has meant that this upper house is not a house that is generally controlled by the government. So therefore, that upper house can exercise, and often does, exercise important oversight over the executive's exercise of public power. And as I've said, in many cases, these upper houses are really the kind of the key accountability or basis or foundational accountability institution for anti-corruption institutions. And we see that when we've seen this recently, that many crossbenchers in the upper house are those who are the most the most likely to support anti-corruption commissions and to support and to provide funding to them and to think of different ways in which to ensure their continuance in their power. So it is very important that upper house plays this kind of critical role in ensuring that these institutions are held accountable, but that they also are supported in their goals and in their exercise of power.
Will, how important is compulsory voting in this, particularly as you've mentioned that the electoral commission, state and federal, their incorruptibility and the public trust in them is so vital. How important is compulsory voting, which is
it's critical. I mean,
unique to Australia.
Yeah, it's another example of Australia's distinctive and unique commitment to voting as the cornerstone of Australian democracy. We can make one comparison. The U.S. presidential election is coming up soon, and there are numbers of different state level attempts to try to suppress the vote in the United States. And we see that the United States does not have the same constitutional commitment or same value for voting that Australia has. Australia has been since the Chartists in the 1850s to this day a critical foundational source of essentially Australian distinctiveness, and we see institutions arising around that, from electoral commissions to compulsory voting to even integrity oversight, which is, of course, a critical way that we ensure that when we vote, that we make informed decisions about who we're voting for, because these integrity institutions are giving us information on how they're exercising their public power.
Well, in the US, we've seen Trump stack the US Supreme Court. We don't go through a process of nomination. This is about judicial independence and its development and evolution in Australia. We must be able to, as people, must be able to trust the judges. How important is the judicial independence, the appointment process, which has to be looked at, because the politicians sometimes can't help themselves in wanting to stack in the battle for power?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one of the key reasons why Australia has not had similar problems that the United States has is that Australia has never given courts and judges as much power as the United States has. The United States Supreme Court is probably one of the most powerful courts in the world. It decides critical issues from abortion to affirmative action to gun rights to all kinds of different things. The types of things that in Australia are decided according to parliamentary debate, elections, voting, and in a much more democratic way. And I think that's something that again, we're thinking about the distinctiveness of our commitment to an electoral form of democracy. Means that the judges don't play as important a role as they do in the United States. And that's, I think, a healthy thing. And we can see why that's a healthy thing, particularly now, because if the courts have a lot of power, it's very tempting to capture them and to use them as a tool. And that's what we've seen with the Republican Party, and particularly Donald Trump in the recent probably 10 years.
How do we maintain the acceptance or the trust in judicial independence? Attorneys General, it's all done, the appointment of judges is all done behind closed doors. The Attorney General talks to the Chief Justice, talks to the Bar Association, the law societies, and what have you. But there's no codified way for the appointment. It's done by convention, as it were. Yeah. Is it strong enough to withstand deleterious or adverse influence?
I mean, I think it is. I think it is in Australia. I mean, those unwritten norms and unwritten conventions to the extent to which they are under some pressure in Australia, we need to begin to think about how we can shore them up through institutions and other things. I mean, one thing, at least with respect to judicial appointments, we could talk about is the role of bar associations and other legal associations in giving qualification status for individual judges and these types of things, ensuring that that appointments are done in a way that are continue the tradition in Australia of making impartial and independent judges, very part of our system. But I think it's also part of thinking about the integrity movement overall is to ensure that we don't see a slipping in standards, that we don't see hyper partisanship enter into appointments. And that's something that I think that the integrity movement is itself involved in and itself both subject to and oversight of. And one thing we need to be thinking of, and one thing we're thinking about at the Center for Public Integrity at the moment is how do we ensure that the heads of, the commissioners or heads of anti-corruption commissions, for instance, are appointed in a way that is independent and fair, and that they're actually going to really hold these guys to account. But those are difficult questions and ones we're kind of thinking through. But we can come up with ways and try to develop ways of ensuring that those decisions are made impartially. And I think that's a really important aspect of the work we're doing.
We'll get to some contentious issues about the National Anti-Corruption Commission in the context of what you've just said a bit later, but I just want to canvass your other research, Will. Over the years, since Federation and before Federation, the governments, state governments, and then later Commonwealth government had resort to royal commissions to address some contentious issue that was distressing and required further objective investigation. There have been stacks of them in Australia. Some have been what you call politically motivated. Others are genuine, trying to find out what's going on with recommendations of what should be done. How important a part has the development of royal commissions with their set terms of reference blended into what became standing anti-corruption commissions?
So, I mean, the answer to the question is that the one of probably the most important foundational texts in the Australia's integrity movement is a Royal Commission report around the WA ink scandal in Western Australia. And this was authored in part by Michael Barker, who was working on this as who's on our board at the CPI, as well as Paul Finn, who recently died, but was one of the a leading academic and later federal judge interested in ideas of public power in public office as a public trust. So I think in many ways, this specific Royal Commission, I call it the foundational text in one of my dispatches, this Royal Commission on the WA ink scandal in Western Australia was critical. And what it does is lay out a very broad and far-reaching and I think incredibly cohesive argument for why we need not just anti-corruption commissions, but ombudsmen. We need upper houses that have parliamentary committees that themselves are independent of the government. We need to have a wide range of kind of what they call constitutional architecture or design that will ensure not just that we are able to vote for our elected representatives every 3 or 4 years, but also that when they are in power, we are able to monitor them and so that we can trust them, so that we can maintain that really valuable, and we talk more about this, how valuable it is, this reserve of trust that Australians have in their elected officials, that when that starts to erode, it's very hard to get back, and we need to hold on to that. And I think very much the integrity movement, and this WA Inc. report that I mentioned is 1991, so it's very, very old. But it is extremely relevant to today and thinking about the challenges that we're facing and thinking about at CPI in the integrity movement itself.
What I learned from Fitzgerald in Queensland, Will, was the change of the rules rather than adversarial proceedings where admissible evidence was debated and what have you. This was inquisitorial. Fitzgerald got the Queensland government to change the Royal Commission rules, which allowed him to use coercive powers to get information which was then publicly released and examined in public. How important is the methodology of standing anti-corruption commissions? I know Royal Commission had the same coercive powers, but it became institutionalized, the methodology that they used.
Well, it's critical. I mean, so if we think of what is the foundational basis of an anti-corruption oversight in the Australian context, it has been since the Fitzgerald Inquiry, WA Inc., and the creation of ICAC in New South Wales, all of which took place in about a 4-year period, roughly, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, was that the foundational idea was that what they were focused on were breaches of the public trust. And what they were meant to do is then to report and show the public when their public officials were in breach of the public trust. And interestingly enough, they weren't viewed at that point as crime commissions. They weren't viewed as souped up prosecutorial, let's get the bad apples for, for violating the law. In fact, what they were doing was trying to say, look, these were essentially good governance institutions, which were reporting to the public and saying, your officials are doing bad things. Here's what they are. And using those investigative powers and public hearings and all the kinds of methods that they have to show, and of course, to shame these individuals. And we've seen how effective it is. ICAC in New South Wales has brought down 3 sitting premiers. And they've done so on the basis of simply just exposing what they were doing in the media and in public hearings. So it is critical that these institutions have this power and that they exercise this power so that these public officials realize that once they get elected, they're still not, they don't just accountable every 3 years. They're accountable all the time. And these integrity oversight institutions are agents of us, the people, in ensuring that when we delegate all this power to them, that they exercise it in a duty relationship with us, that they are acting in our interests, in the public interest.
But Will, they've been derided by many critics and victims, can I call them that, victims who've been humiliated or embarrassed by being called as Russian. You can speak Russian, as Russian show trials. How do they counter that characterization? Because it can be very damaging the public mind. That as we've seen with Trump and the DOJ's pursuing him, that you're politicizing. This is a political attack on me and my integrity using the show trials. How do these anti-corruption commissions counter that characterization?
It's a good question. So, I mean, the first thing to say is that they're not trials, right? That these anti-corruption commissions have no power to prosecute or to incarcerate or to even enforce the law. They can, of course, refer it to the prosecutorial branches if they want to. But with the one exception of the Victorian one, which is, I think, outside this tradition, every other anti-corruption institution in Australia is essentially an information producing institution. It's going out and finding information and it's publishing it about these individuals. And of course, politicians who are behaving badly don't like to be called out on that, right? That's not surprising, but that's not an excuse for them to then turn and say, well, this is illegitimate. In fact, it's the opposite. It's exactly what I think most Australians would want from these institutions, is to do this type of oversight. And the kind of the argument that's a star chamber or a Russian style show trial is just completely missing the point of what they're doing. And it's also missing the point that what they're trying to do is ensure that these individuals who are exercising public power exercise it in a public interest, right? Because I think sometimes we get politicians who lose a little bit of a kind of idea of that, okay, well, I've been elected, I can kind of use this a little bit for some partisan gain. I'm going to want to ensure that we win the next election. No, you're exercising this power, whether it's spending money or making decisions administratively, whatever, you're doing so in the public interest rather than the private or partisan interests. And it's up to these institutions to publish it and inform the public when they think that trust relationship has been violated.
So we really need the institutions itself, the anti-corruption bodies themselves, to educate the politicians and the public about exactly what the limits of their powers are, and to counter the mischaracterization of their functions. So it's
And
up to
I
them.
would say as well, I mean, it's difficult often for commissioners themselves to really, go out and prosecute this message, because they're meant to be, they're meant to be focusing on corruption themselves. So, and this is where I think the role of institutions like the Center for Public Integrity is so significant. NGOs play a critical role in, we talk to media, we talk to all kinds of different groups, and we say, look, this is what they're for. This is what they're meant to do. Try to, so I think there's an educational role around what they're doing that, that they look to us to do, to ensure that we understand. Because I think part of the criticism is people don't fully understand what these institutions are meant to do. Once they do, I think they'll say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. A lot of that criticism is misplaced. And I think so that's something that we are doing and will continue to hopefully do more and more in coming years to try to shore up this movement as it faces some challenges.
It sure does. Will, you're a constitutional expert. Are these bodies, including now the National Anti-Corruption Commission, bulletproof from constitutional challenge?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, I don't see any way in which, first of all, I've never seen a constitutional challenge. There'd be no basis in the Constitution to challenge these institutions. What anti-corruption oversight or ombudsman or any kind of integrity institutions, they're set up by legislation. They are often called independent officers of parliament. And what they're really doing is actually vindicating a constitutional principle, which is what we call responsible government. The idea that the executive is ultimately responsible to parliament, not the opposite. And and we've seen over time that constitutional principle and unwritten rule kind of erode. And what integrity institutions are doing is a new institutional adaptation to ensure that Parliament can delegate some of its integrity, that oversight, kind of responsible government power to these institutions, and they do that. So I think if anything, the High Court would view these as actually very much part of a constitutional system that we have and that are very much consistent with it.
Are you tracking the challenges of the findings of, say, the New South Wales ICAC to the High Court? I mean, the number of cases have been all the way up to the High Court. Are you keeping a monitor on those cases to establish the constitutional validity of the anti-corruption movement or the integrity movement in Australia?
Yeah, so there are always a lot of challenges. None of them are actually focused on the validity of the institution themselves. Instead, what there often are statutory interpretation questions, right, about what are the actual scope of the powers. And so that we've seen that in the AB and IBAC case, which was recently in the High Court. We saw that in the Queensland case, in the Carney Triple C in the Carney case. So we're seeing, and those are almost always about how should we interpret the scope of the powers that parliaments have given these institutions, and the extent to which the High Court sometimes says it's not as broad as the Anti-Corruption Commission's thought. So then what you need to then do is just change the legislation. And in fact, we've been involved at the CPI in starting to work on some of those types of issues. At least in the Victorian context, we've always been stated that the definition of corrupt conduct is far too narrow, and some of the way in which the adverse materials discussion is, so some of the drafting needs to be changed. But it's really a question of Parliament informing our parliamentary representatives of what these institutions are meant to do and getting the drafting right, and then the courts will get out of the way.
Okay, and in that case, those cases are very instructive to us about amendment and
yeah, I think so.
But Will, there's a few problems. Look, just take us through briefly the South Australian case where the commissioner that we did go up to the High Court. Just explain that where it became a dependent corruption commission against corruption.
Yeah, so in South
Australia?
That's right. I mean, and again, this is a question of legislative drafting. In 2021, when most of Australia was focused on vaccine take up and trying getting moving away from lockdowns and so forth, the South Australian Parliament stripped away a significant amount of powers of the South Australian Anti-Corruption Commission at that point, headed by Anne Vanstone. And since then, the commission has tried to lobby and try to explain to Parliament why those powers need to be restored. That has not happened. So again, and ultimately the commissioner, Anne Vanstone, has resigned as of about a month and a half ago, and wrote the report that you mentioned, the dependent commission against corruption, because in the way in which the parliament in that case stripped away the power to really to do the kind of things we've been talking about, the center of the integrity movement, which is looking into breaches of the public trust, or what in that specific statute says maladministration, misconduct in public office, and these types of things. And there's a clear reason why they did this in South Australia, is because the members of the parliament didn't like the oversight that they were facing. But I do think we're hopefully going to be seeing, and again, the center is working closely with some members, particularly the upper house, who are interested in kind of re-energizing or giving these powers back to this institution, because I think they see South Australia was one of the most democratically innovative places in Australia from foundation all the way through to today, and now it is a significant laggard backslider. And I think, so hopefully that will change. But it's again shining light on this and trying to figure out exactly what's going wrong, so that we can fix this. But yeah, you're right. That has been a significant setback, I think, in the anti corruption movement, integrity movement in general.
And Will, you mentioned in one of your dispatches the WA Parliamentary Committee complaint. What was that about?
So there, we're seeing that there has been a long-standing convention that the Premier, when appointing members of not just the Anti-Corruption Commission there, but other integrity institutions like the Ombudsman, would consult with the committee. And the committee played a really important role in, I think, ensuring that we get good appointments to these positions, because of course, without good appointments, you don't get good oversight. And what they've reported on, and what we've been seeing in WA in recent years, in the last year or two, is an erosion of that consultation, and I think that's a problem. It's a significant problem, because it means you're going to get more likely to get kind of political appointees to these integrity oversight committees, and they're not going to do their job. They're going to because in many cases they're going to simply they will have come from a position where they say, well, we're just not going to hold these guys to the fire, because that's it's not what we were appointed to do, and they're going to largely sit on their hands. So we need active people in charge of these institutions who understand their role and understand what exactly they're there to be doing. And I think we need parliamentary committees to be consulting and playing a big role in this, because they can help shore that up, I think.
And that's a role for the Centre for Public Integrity, for all people of goodwill to assist. Being an old political reporter, I'm very fearful that there can be behind the Speaker's chair almost collusion, if you like. I'm sorry to be a conspiracy theorist, but an understanding that goes across party lines, major party lines, that we're going to spike these buggers. They're interfering in our. We're elected, as you said earlier. We're elected in our own right. We should have the discretion that the electorate has given us without any of this oversight. And if we can get together, we've got the numbers on the floor of the parliaments to do them over.
Yeah, I mean, we see that. I mean, that's the story in South Australia. That's precisely what happened in 2021. We had the two major parties, the Liberals and Labor, getting together and essentially saying, let's strip this institution of its power. And how do you combat that? Well, one way to combat that is to talk to the media, talk to groups like Center for Public Integrity, talk to me and say why this is so problematic, why this is undemocratic. But the other obvious constituency to rely on in this type of question is our crossbenchers and independent MPs, whether often in the upper house, but sometimes even in the lower house, who themselves are not part of the big party structures, right? And in many cases, we see them as the critical players in shoring up integrity oversight and making political arguments for why these institutions should be supported. A good example of this now is the role of Tim Reid, who's a member of the Greens in the upper house Legislative Council in Victoria. He has played a really critical role in the Integrity and Oversight Committee in the Victorian Parliament. Recently, as in about a week or 2 weeks ago, he wrote a very good report on the problems of freedom of information in Victoria and how bad Victoria is in this respect. So we can see that in many cases there are natural constituencies for this, even within Parliament, who can then make these arguments. And then, of course, we can see with the Teals. The Teals won votes on integrity as well in the federal election. So it's an issue that I think Australians are concerned about, and it's one that, as long as it's raised, I think politicians are going to be, the major parties are going to be less willing to collude in the way that you see it. But when we're distracted, when we're not focused on this, or when we don't understand the integrity, what it's meant to be doing, then that is when they can seize on these opportunities. So I think we need to be very clear and make it very clear in the work, and that's really what the center is trying to do to media and in other ways to crossbenchers and others, to say, let's make this case publicly as much as we can to the, and I think it will be much more likely that these institutions will end up like electoral commissions. We don't see attacks on electoral commissions because they are viewed as sacrosanct. And I think hopefully, if the center is able to do a long-term project in 10 to 15 years, we'll see anti-corruption will be a similar type of thing in the Australian context.
Sorry to be cynical, but there's a lot of work still to be done.
A lot to be done. Yeah.
Which brings us to the National Anti-Corruption Commission. And as you said, the Teals, the so-called Teals, the independents, meritorious independents, I call them, seem to me to be instrumental in moving the Parliament, the federal Parliament, to the establishment of the National Anti-Corruption Commission. The Greens, Pocock, various crossbench senators changed the nature of it. And we got to see where this develops in federal politics in the coming federal election. I think integrity will be back up there in the 2025 federal election, because the Teals are dissatisfied about the behaviour, about the what we'd all hope would be the benefits of a National Anti-Corruption Commission. Well, in a nutshell, what's gone wrong? The integrity movement had a major success in the establishment of a National Anti-Corruption Commission. What's gone wrong?
Well, look, I think I don't know if it's necessarily gone wrong, but it just shows that creating these institutions is not enough, right? We need to understand what they're meant to do and then hold them to account. And I think that's the debate we're having now. So if you look at the fact that the National Anti-Corruption Commission has chosen not to investigate the robo-debt scandal, that to me, I think is extremely problematic, because the robo-debt scandal was a massive breach of the public trust. And the way that we see Paul Brereton, who is the commissioner of NAC, of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, has explained it as well. Everyone else is being kind of investigated by other institutions and blah, blah, blah. So therefore, we don't want to duplicate. Well, of course, you wouldn't be duplicating. What you'd be doing is actually looking broadly into this incredibly problematic scheme and exposing breaches of the public trust amongst individuals as well as systemic ones. That work has not been done, and the fact that they haven't done it suggests that the current leadership, I think, at NAC does not understand what they're meant to be doing, or they don't understand the integrity movement itself in Australia and what role it's meant to play. And I think that's a problem. So I think part of it is helping to inform politicians and hopefully the parliamentary committee who's responsible for NAC itself can play some role in doing this. I know we're waiting on the Gail Furness report from who's the inspector on this, which will be coming out likely next or later this month, I think. So, this is still very much, I think, in play, and I hope that it is a good learning experience for NAC, that it begins to see that it actually has not been, it has abdicated its role in many ways and needs to play a better role, but we need to push it in that direction, I think, because it doesn't seem to be doing it itself.
It's very distressing to me to hear you say that. It's accurate, I think, how you've summarised that problem. But one of the other difficulties that I discerned as an old political reporter was Albo, the Prime Minister, doing a deal behind the Speaker's chair with Peter Dutton, the LNP leader, on the issue, and gave their writing instructions to Dreyfus, the Attorney General, on the issue of public hearings. because the political interest got through that they didn't want what Scott Morrison called the show trial of the New South Wales ICAC, not accepting the educative benefit of public hearings, so the public got to trust that there was an accountability mechanism there. Do you canvass that? Are you canvassing that? Because it was of great concern to all the people who support the Centre for Public Integrity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a significant. There were two areas. You mentioned one with respect to public hearings. The other area where I think the actual drafting was deficient was that the oversight committee itself is not headed by an independent or is not statutorily required to be headed by an individual who's independent of government, whether it's a crossbencher or a member of the opposition, which we see in other contexts. So I think, there were, maybe change comes slowly in this kind of area. I think it was a huge victory to get the NAC created in the first place. It's not perfect. It needs to be improved, and it's going to require us pushing in future elections, right? Doing what we're talking about at the beginning of this conversation, using our powers of the ballot box, voting for individuals who are really interested and care about this type of thing and understand its vital importance to our maintaining public trust in our institutions, so that we do not head down the road that we see in the United States, for instance, where public trust has never been lower, and it leads to the kinds of individuals and so forth like Donald Trump and power. So we need to maintain that trust, and making that case over and over and over again is something the center tries to do, and that we can try to get more and more into the general public discussion. And I hope that you're right, when it will take time. This is not a short-term, but it will take a lot of work, but it will be hopefully something that we can continue to do. But the good news is we're not drawing on nothing. We have a deep tradition of this in Australia, and I think Australian voters get this. They're concerned, and we hear it from the people who support the center. They're concerned about this as well. So I think it's building as much as we can and making these arguments and crystallizing them, and making them very much clear that these types of oversight is nothing. This is nothing new. This is essentially responsible government. This is holding the individuals who exercise public power in the executive branch to account. That's what's scary about that.
Yes,
to us, maybe to the politicians. That's right.
Hey, listen, if anybody's got a question, please get on the chat. I can watch it here on my screen while we sum up with Will. The term independent, just back to the NACC, the term independent is not in the title of the National Anti-Corruption Commission Act, but it's clearly within its remit that it is independent. Brereton was the commissioner, and the sub-commissioners. I mean, Dreyfus told me that to build in incorruptibility, you needed more than one commissioner. You needed a couple, so that they all were responsible for signing off, particularly if they're going to tread on the toes of very powerful people within the polity of Australia. That seemed to make sense. But is there any problem about the word independent not being in the title?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, the key point to make with respect to anti-corruption commissions, like courts, right, is that they are inevitably appointed by elected officials. That's good. That's a good thing, right? They're not these headless, branches of government they're purely technocratic. They are ultimately responsible to us and to our elected representatives, but we create structures and procedures around the appointments and the way that they operate and the way that they're funded. Hopefully, this is something the center's working on, so that they are exercised at arm's length, or in that are distanced from those public officials in a way that they can feel comfortable, and that they will understand that they play an important role in ensuring that those public officials, even the ones that appoint them, are acting within the public trust, right? So it's a matter of finding that balance, because of course they're independent, but they're not completely independent. Well, and we don't in our democratic system have any completely independent institutions that are, everything has to be appointed by a public official. It's just how we do that and ensure that. And I think with the NAC, I mean, the NAC, my optimistic, hopeful approach in the NAC is we're still early, right? And that this is we are learning, and I hopefully think this is a good learning experience for NAC, and for whoever comes, the next commissioner can see, okay, well, maybe, we change tack or see something else, understand a little bit more about the role, because I think it's about setting the right norms for how they operate, and thinking about, and again, I think the model is the Electoral Commission at the state and Commonwealth level, which are essentially untouchable and have all these norms around them that protect them from political attacks. And if we can in 15 years say that we've gotten anti-corruption commissions even just a couple steps closer to that, I think we've been successful. And that's really a big part of the work that I'm doing, and that the centre's been doing, will be doing in the coming years.
Well, Australia's got a population of 27 million. We've got a unique, as we've discussed, colonies, states, territories, and a federal federation. Is there anywhere else in the world, you've been all over in your investigation, anywhere else in the world that has this? I mean, you came from Hong Kong, and you've had experience in Hong Kong, and my recollection was the New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption was actually their enabling legislation was formed from the Hong Kong experience when it was a British protectorate. So is there anything, take us around the world as far as the integrity movement is concerned, as difficult as that is?
Well, it's funny you asked that question. I'm currently working with a research assistant on that very question. He's one of my PhD students who's actually from Hong Kong, and we've been working and looking at the ICA, the Independent Corruption Against Commission in Hong Kong. That was essentially a prosecutorial souped up crime commission. And what's really interesting is that Australia often is the story that's often told is that Australia followed that. Well, they called it the same thing in New South Wales. They called it an Independent Corruption Commission Against Corruption, but it was a completely different institutional setup and a completely different concept of its role, which was to tackle breaches of the public trust. And you see that in the second reading speech by the Premier Grenier at the time, was basically saying, this is not a crime commission. So it's really interesting to see how distinctive Australia is. And I mean, another example, I've been in Berlin on my sabbatical. I'm now in Montreal, but I was in Berlin, and I was talking to a German scholar who studies Australia and thinks Australia is one of the really interesting, understudied systems of distinctive democratic setups in the world. And he says, look, it needs to be understood more broadly so that we can kind of talk about it to the world, because it has a lot of really interesting elements. But it is in many cases, I think, like all places, distinctive, but particularly distinctive, I think. And I think we should be thinking about the real advantages as well as thinking about how we can fix some of the problems of the system that are emerging.
Well, maybe we should export it. That is a very positive story in a world where the democracies now, with all our failings and distortions and disinformation in the digital revolution, where I'm dealing with it constantly, it's the democracies against the authoritarians that we're confronted with, China and Putin. That is something that we should be celebrating, isn't it? That if we can make our democracies more functional through integrity movement, that is a very wonderful contribution that we could make to functionality.
One of the things I say when I've been saying on this sabbatical, different talks and so forth, is one of the things that I take with me as someone who spent 10 years teaching Australian constitutional law, studying Australian constitutional history, and writing about it, in addition to my other comparative interests, is the extent to which Australia teaches the world about the importance of structure, right? Australia doesn't have constitutional rights. It doesn't have powerful courts, but it has structures, and it has a deep debate about how structures play a role and help enable the people to play a role and continue to play a role in their self-governance and to trust in their self-governance. So, that's what we're doing at the center. That's my work at the center, is really thinking about, and I think the cutting edge of that at the moment in the Australian debate around structure is the role and position of integrity institutions. How do we fund them? How do we appoint them? How do we empower them? How do we talk about them to legislatures so that they understand exactly what role they play, and how do we protect them when they're under attack from from different parties, or when parties are working together, and trying to make that case to the media, to the people, and to legislatures across the different ways, because it is this structural architecture that Australia has built is, I think, really, really valuable, because it protects, again, that idea that as we see autocracies rise around the world, what are they driven by? A lack of public trust. Backsliding is an authoritarian practices are infiltrating places like the United States because of loss of decreasing public trust. And I think the Americans could learn maybe a bit about thinking about their own constitutional structure to try to rebuild that if they can. But that's, I think, something that Australia does, and certainly something we want to maintain and to continue into the future. That we don't lose track of how distinctive and important our tradition is of this. Because you do sometimes get a little concerned when you see how little understanding the NAC seems to have of this role, or what happened in South Australia in 2021. So it's not, this kind of tradition doesn't just continue on its own. It needs us, it needs the center and other individuals to continue to push it, to make the case for it, why it's important and why it's important to maintaining our democracy.
You mentioned resourcing, and the Centre monitors the adequacy of resourcing to these anti-corruption bodies, and for all the other oversight, the parliamentarians, the crossbenchers, the upper houses. Will, is there any state in the United States that has anything equivalent to an anti-corruption body, a standing anti-corruption body? They've got grand juries and all sorts of other structures. Is there anything that's equivalent to this with appointment?
Nothing really. I mean, the U.S. system has largely relied on legal accountability, right? Through prosecution, through and we can take just one recent example: the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, who's currently being prosecuted for corruption. That's a legal prosecution. It's pretty clear he's breached the public trust in what he was doing with Turkish Airlines and all that kind of stuff. But the way it's framed in the American situation is a legal accountability kind of argument, and I think that has real limitations. And I think that often is the way that we saw. It's the way I think it was the ICAC in Hong Kong was set up. It's the way we see anti-corruption in other contexts is a legal one. But what's really unique and I think special and distinctive, and what we need to hold on to in the Australian context is that the political role that these anti-corruption commissions play here in investigating, holding public hearings, and then reporting to the people on what they find, and letting the people decide in the end. If we get a report and the people just turn up there and say, okay, you know what, that's probably okay, that's fine. It becomes a political type of process, and that feeds into our system of political constitutionalism that is very deep, and that deeply underpins our system, where we think we do things through electoral voting and through politics and through parliamentary politics and reporting and those types of things. And we have this vast array of institutions that do this, that ensure this, not just anti-corruption commissions. You've mentioned royal commissions, and so forth, the electoral commissions, all these types of things that ensure that when we vote, we understand who our politicians are, what they're doing, who they are, and how they exercise power, so that we can make the right decisions when we vote.
I've got 3 points from the great Stephen Charles. He says 3 things wrong with the NACC. 1, public hearings only in exceptional circumstances.
Yeah.
2, government controls the NACC through the chair of the Oversight Committee. The ALP in the Dreyfus case has got, you've mentioned that. And 3, they appointed the wrong commissioner, which is down to the Attorney General if Brereton doesn't vindicate himself through subsequent actions. And Margaret White says, Will, to what extent does the requirement to hear evidence in public only in exceptional circumstances impede the proper operations of the NACC or any other corruption body, that limitation to what they can do in public?
Yeah, so that limitation comes from the Victorian Anti-Corruption Commission, the Independent Broad-Based Anti-Corruption Commission, the IBAC. It is outside the integrity tradition that I understand Australia to have, because it does not understand and does not reflect the central importance of these institutions in informing the public about breaches of the public trust, right? If we think it's quite simple what these institutions have been established from the late 1980s and the early 1990s until today, the dominant approach in Australia has been that they have a broad remit to investigate and report and have public hearings so that the people understand, that we, the voters, we, the people, understand how our public officials are exercising power. And you can understand why public officials don't like that, because in some cases there are entrenched cultures of corruption when it comes to whether it's with respect to spending of money to win, in marginal constituencies, the sports rorts or something like that, or the kind of robo-debt stuff where you see members of the public service trying to kind of anticipate what public officials want to do. All of these are not coming out of nowhere, and the whole purpose of these public hearings is to root them out. And of course, that's whenever you're rooting out a culture of corruption, it's painful, and particularly for those individuals, those politicians who are involved in it, because they think it's normal, and then they get told it isn't. And and of course they're not going to like that, but that's a problem. That's their problem, not our problem, right? So, and I think so we just need to make that case. And as a result, yeah, that part of the provision is insufficient. We should have public hearings in most cases. In fact, there may only be exceptional reasons why we shouldn't hold public hearings. But otherwise, why not hold public hearings for most investigations? Because again, if we think of their role as being one about information, providing information to the people to ensure that they're able to understand how public power is exercised.
Well, I'm sure in the context of the next federal election, the independents, the crossbench movement will raise that issue about the limitations on the National Anti-Corruption Commission themselves. And it's sort of a game changer in Australia. We don't know where it's going at the moment, because I think the Don Farrell is going to try to change the rules on funding against the billionaires and the influence peddling that comes from very wealthy vested interests in Australia. It may have an impact, yet we've got to see the legislation on the fan-based funding of the independent movement that's been quite significant in the last federal election. But I'm sure all those independent candidates are going to raise a reform of the National Anti-Corruption Commission in exceptional circumstances. And what Stephen raises about the parliamentary committee having an independent chair, so a non-partisan structure would be very important to raise. So those issues are going to be live for the foreseeable future, as well as what's happening in WA and South Australia and the other anti-corruption commissions. Look, Will, you've been wonderful. Thanks very much for giving us so much of your time. What's your next step with the dispatches? How much more work have you got to do?
Well, I mean, there's really the work will continue in the dispatches, which on two different bases, which you can already see in what I've produced so far, which is continuing to look into the historical development of the Australian tradition. And as I said, one of the kind of the future dispatch will talk about how different the ICAC in New South Wales was than its at least naming predecessor in Hong Kong. And further suggestion, I think, further evidence of the distinctiveness of the Australian tradition and why we need to really kind of treasure that and preserve it. So I'll be doing more work on the history. So the kind of what we call, maybe I'll call even like the kind of vertical, and then horizontally, that will then feed into the work that I'm doing and the center will be doing on looking at how we can better fund these institutions so that we can distance funding decisions from the executive. We've been talking to the ACT, which has a very interesting model whereby the independent and officers of Parliament, the integrity oversight committees, agencies like anti-corruption and so forth have a kind of special budgetary process whereby they put forward a proposal for a certain amount of money, and then if the executive knocks it back, they have to give reasons. So that's quite an interesting model. So we're looking at that kind of thing. Also, appointments is another really important way. How do we get the appointments right? Because I think I share some of Stephen's views with respect to the appointment of the first NAC commissioner, that, you know, it maybe Dreyfus didn't know at the time, but, you know, getting the right person in that seat is critical, I think, for these, and they have to understand
Right.
what their role is. So yeah, thinking about those types of questions of basically how we set these things up, where, and that's a broader question of where they fit in the constitutional architecture. And I think so and those two are going to feed into each other, those two projects, and I'll be working on this for at least the next 3 years. So plenty of time. And as you've mentioned, Quentin, all of these are long-term projects, but slowly we can begin to get these ideas really seep these ideas into the mainstream, so that they become, people really do understand how valuable and precious the system of oversight we have is, and why it needs to be maintained, and maybe in some cases strengthened.
Well, here's to democracy, Will, and accountability. Thanks very much indeed for your time, your brain space, and keep up the good work. And thanks to everybody for participating in this. Let's get on. Oh, we missed the Vance waltz debate, but this is just as important. Thanks very much, Will.
Thank you, Quentin, for all your questions and engagement on this. It's fantastic.
All the best.